In the pre-dawn stillness of a remote military base in southeastern Cuba, a chain-link gate clanks open. Beyond it lies a facility that has held hundreds of men for nearly a quarter century. Some have long faces marked by decades of detention. Others walk with uncertainty, unsure of what comes next. Once known for holding captured individuals in the aftermath of the attacks on the United States in 2001, this place still holds people more than 24 years later, even as governments, courts, and advocates debate what Guantánamo Bay should be today. What is the reality of Guantánamo Bay in 2026, and why does this remote prison remain open when so many believed it would close? Intro. This documentary examines the real history, ongoing operations, and controversies surrounding the Guantánamo Bay detention facility in 2026. We will explore how and why the camp was created, how its purpose changed over time, and what its continued existence means for international law, human rights, and U.S. policy. Every event described here is based on documented information from official records, reputable reporting, and verifiable sources. This is a factual educational account intended to inform and explain, not to sensationalize. The prison built for a new kind of war. Guantánamo Bay is not just a prison. It is a U.S. military base on Cuban land, controlled by the United States for more than a century. Long before the world associated it with terrorism suspects and global controversy, it was already a strategic outpost, isolated, heavily guarded, and politically complicated. But after September 11, 2001, Guantánamo Bay became something else entirely. It became a place designed for a new kind of war. A war where the battlefield was not one country, and where the prisoners were not treated like normal prisoners. The decision that changed everything. In late 2001, the United States launched military operations in Afghanistan. The goal was to dismantle al-Qaeda and remove the Taliban government that had sheltered them. As people were captured during these operations, a major question quickly emerged. Where should they be taken? Bringing them to the United States was politically risky. Holding them in Afghanistan was unstable. And placing them in traditional prisons overseas raised legal concerns. So U.S. officials turned to Guantánamo Bay. It was far from U.S. courts, far from public attention, and already under U.S. control. To many in government it looked like the perfect solution. January 2002, the first prisoners arrive. On January 11, 2002, the first group of detainees arrived at Guantánamo Bay. Photos of men in orange jumpsuits, kneeling behind fences, quickly spread across the world. Their faces were covered. U.S. soldiers stood nearby. Those images became a symbol almost instantly. And they sparked a global reaction. To U.S. officials, Guantánamo was a necessary tool to prevent future attacks. To critics, it looked like the beginning of a detention system that might exist outside normal law. Enemy combatants, a new legal category. One of the most important parts of Guantánamo's story is not just what happened there. It is how the people held there were classified. The U.S. government did not treat most detainees as prisoners of war under the Geneva Conventions. Instead, many were labeled enemy combatants. This label mattered, because it suggested they could be held without the same protections given to traditional POWs. And it raised a powerful question. If someone is not a prisoner of war and not a criminal defendant in a normal court, then what are they? Camp X-Ray and the world watching. The first detention site was known as Camp X-Ray. It was temporary, built quickly, and exposed to harsh weather. It was later replaced by more permanent facilities including Camp Delta. As the months passed, Guantánamo expanded. So did the controversy. Reports began to circulate about harsh interrogation practices, indefinite detention, and detainees being held for years without formal charges. U.S. officials defended the system as legal and necessary. Human rights organizations argued it was a dangerous violation of international standards. And the world began to realize that Guantánamo Bay was not going to be a short-term operation. The numbers behind the prison. Over the years, nearly 800 detainees passed through Guantánamo Bay. Many were later transferred to other countries. Some were released without being charged. Others remained held for years. And a smaller number became part of long-running military commission cases, legal proceedings that moved slowly and faced repeated challenges. Guantánamo became a place where time itself seemed different. Where a person could be held not for weeks, but for decades. The camp that wouldn't close. By the mid-2000s, the prison was already a major political issue. U.S. presidents promised reforms. Some promised closure. But Guantánamo remained. Year after year, it survived legal battles, international criticism, and shifting political leadership. And by the time the world entered the 2020s, the question was no longer, how did this happen? The question became something else. How is it still happening? The turning point. Because by 2026, Guantánamo Bay is no longer the massive detention system it once was. The population is far smaller. The world's attention has shifted. And yet the facility remains open, still operating, still funded, still guarded. And for the men still inside, the same uncertainty remains. Will they ever face a real trial? Will they ever be released? Or will Guantánamo Bay remain their prison forever? And if this facility still exists after nearly 25 years, what does that say about the system that created it? Because the truth is, Guantánamo did not survive by accident. It survived because powerful institutions kept it alive. And the deeper we look into how it operates in 2026, the more complicated and unsettling the reality becomes. The courts, the chains, and the legal battle for control. By the time Guantánamo Bay became known around the world, it had already created a legal problem that no modern democracy had faced before. The U.S. government was holding hundreds of detainees in a military prison outside the mainland United States. Many had no criminal charges. Many had no trial date. And many had no clear path out. For years, the official position was simple. These detainees were being held as part of a global conflict, and the government believed it could keep them there as long as the war continued. But there was one issue. Wars like this do not end neatly. And the courts began to ask a question that would shape Guantanamo's future. Who has the power to decide how long someone can be held? The first major crack in the system. In the early years, the U.S. government argued that detainees at Guantánamo could not challenge their detention in U.S. courts. The reasoning was based on geography. Guantánamo Bay was not technically U.S. soil. So, officials believed U.S. constitutional rights did not fully apply. But in 2004, the U.S. Supreme Court delivered a decision that changed everything. The court ruled that detainees had the right to challenge their detention in U.S. federal courts. This was a major moment. Because for the first time, the legal wall around Guantánamo began to collapse. And it forced the government to respond. The government creates a new system. After the court decision, the U.S. created special review processes. These hearings were meant to determine whether detainees were properly classified as enemy combatants. But critics argued the system was not fair. Some detainees had limited access to evidence. Some could not see classified information being used against them. And in many cases, the detainees' fate depended on intelligence reports that could not be publicly verified. Even worse, some reports later turned out to be based on unreliable sources. Guantánamo was no longer just a prison. It was becoming a legal battlefield. The military commissions. Instead of using regular civilian courts, the U.S. government chose another route. It created a special trial system called military commissions. These commissions were designed for detainees accused of terrorism-related crimes. Supporters argued military commissions were necessary for national security. They said civilian courts could expose classified intelligence. They said the crimes were linked to war, not normal criminal activity. But critics argued the commissions were unstable and inconsistent. Rules changed repeatedly. Cases were delayed. Some convictions were overturned. And legal challenges kept piling up. By the late 2000s, Guantánamo trials were moving slowly, sometimes barely moving at all. 2008, the Supreme Court speaks again. In 2008, the Supreme Court delivered another major ruling. It stated that detainees had a constitutional right to habeas corpus, meaning they could challenge their detention before a judge. This was not a small detail. It was a direct statement that Guantánamo could not exist outside the reach of American law. But even after that ruling, the system did not collapse. Instead, it became more complicated. The government continued holding detainees. Courts continued hearing cases. And Guantánamo remained open. The reality of forever prisoners. Over time, Guantánamo developed a category of detainees that became known to many observers as forever prisoners. These were men who the government believed were dangerous enough to keep detained, but not easy to prosecute in court. Sometimes evidence was classified. Sometimes evidence was considered unreliable. Sometimes evidence came from interrogations that raised legal concerns. So these detainees remained stuck in a legal limbo. Not convicted. Not cleared. Not released. Just held. And as the years passed, the question became unavoidable. How long can a person be imprisoned without a final legal outcome? Obama's promise, and the wall he hit. When President Barack Obama entered office in 2009, he publicly promised to close Guantánamo. It was one of his first major announcements. But closing Guantánamo turned out to be far harder than promising it. Some detainees could not be sent home because their home countries were unstable. Some could not be transferred due to fear of torture or retaliation. Congress restricted funding to move detainees into the United States. And politically, Guantánamo became a symbol that few leaders wanted to touch. The prison remained open. Even as its population slowly decreased. The Trump years, the freeze. When President Donald Trump took office, the policy shifted. Instead of focusing on closure, his administration supported keeping Guantánamo open. Transfers slowed. The prison stayed in place. And for detainees still inside, the message became clear. They should not expect fast change. Even though fewer detainees remained, the structure of Guantánamo stayed the same. The guards remained. The legal teams remained. The fences remained. Biden's era, quiet transfers, slow movement. Under President Joe Biden, the U.S. began transferring some detainees again. Some men were sent to other countries after diplomatic agreements. But Guantánamo did not close. The remaining detainees included some of the most legally complicated cases in the facility's history. And by the mid-2020s, the system reached a strange new stage. Guantánamo was no longer overflowing. It was no longer dominating headlines daily. But it was still there, still expensive, still controversial, and still unresolved. 2026. The courtroom that still has no ending. By 2026, the military commission cases connected to the September 11th attacks were still ongoing. They had faced years of delays, disputes over evidence, and legal questions about interrogation history. Even after decades, the most important trials had not reached a final conclusion. This created a harsh reality. Guantánamo was built as an emergency response. But it became permanent. A prison designed for a moment of crisis. That turned into a long-term institution. The turning point. And this is where the story becomes even more troubling. Because in 2026, Guantánamo is not defined by chaos anymore. It is defined by routine. A routine where detainees wake up every day inside a system that has never fully decided what they are. A routine where the United States continues paying millions to operate a prison with a shrinking population. A routine where legal arguments continue year after year, while time passes for everyone inside. And the question that haunts Guantánamo becomes sharper than ever. If the world's most powerful democracy cannot resolve the fate of the men it holds, what does that mean for justice itself? Because the next part of the story is not about law anymore. It's about life inside the fortress. What daily existence looks like. What control really means. And why Guantánamo, even with fewer prisoners, still feels like a shadow hanging over global history. Life inside the shadow fortress. By 2026, Guantánamo Bay is no longer packed with hundreds of detainees like it was in the early 2000s. The population is smaller. The noise is quieter. The world pays less attention. But the prison is still running. And inside the fences, life still follows a strict system designed for one purpose. Control. Not just physical control, but control of time, movement, information, and hope. Because Guantánamo is not like a normal prison. It was never built to rehabilitate. It was built to contain. A facility built to isolate. Guantánamo Bay detention operations are spread across different camps and facilities. Over the years, some camps were shut down, rebuilt, or reorganized. But the central structure remained. High fencing, surveillance, multiple layers of checkpoints, constant monitoring. And in 2026, even though fewer detainees remain, the security system is still intense. That is because Guantánamo is not treated like a standard detention center. It is treated like a permanent national security site. A day that feels the same every time. For detainees, daily life often follows a routine. Wake up. Meals delivered. Limited movement. Short periods of recreation. Medical checkups when scheduled. Interactions with guards that are controlled and monitored. And for many detainees, the hardest part is not just the rules. It is the repetition. In a normal prison, a person may have a sentence and a release date. In Guantánamo, many detainees have lived for years without knowing when their detention will end. That uncertainty changes everything. Because when there is no clear finish line, every day feels like it could repeat forever. Medical care, aging, and a new problem. One of the biggest changes in Guantánamo by 2026 is something few people talk about. The detainees are getting older. Some have been held since the early 2000s. That means the facility now faces a long-term issue it was never designed for. Chronic medical conditions. Aging bodies. Mental health deterioration. The need for specialized care. Guantánamo was built quickly for wartime detention. But by 2026, it is managing long-term prisoners, some of whom require serious medical treatment. This raises difficult questions for the U.S. government. How do you keep a detention system running for decades? How do you manage healthcare in a facility that is isolated from major civilian hospitals? And what happens if detainees become too sick to remain inside? The role of guards in the military system. Guantánamo is operated by U.S. military personnel. Guards rotate in and out. Some stay for limited assignments. Others return multiple times. To the public, guards are often viewed in one of two ways, either as villains or heroes. But the reality is usually more complicated. Many guards describe their role as strict and procedural. They follow orders. They follow protocols. They work in an environment where even small mistakes are treated as serious security risks. And over time, that creates a culture of caution and distance. Because in Guantánamo, trust is not encouraged. It is managed. Legal meetings in a place designed to restrict. Even though detainees are held under heavy control, many still have legal teams. Lawyers travel long distances to reach the base. Meetings happen under strict conditions. Communication is monitored. And the legal process itself moves slowly. For some detainees, these meetings are the only time they feel connected to the outside world. But for many, the legal process has been so delayed that it becomes exhausting. A case can take years just to reach a hearing. Evidence disputes can take longer than some prison sentences in civilian courts. And by 2026, that delay has become part of the experience. Not just a legal issue, but a daily reality. Information control in the outside world. Another major part of Guantánamo is how information is handled. Detainees do not have free access to news. They do not use the internet. Their contact with the outside world is extremely limited. Mail is screened. Phone calls are controlled. Visits are rare. And this creates a strange psychological environment. Because the outside world keeps moving forward. Governments change. Wars start and end. New generations grow up. But inside Guantánamo, time moves differently. For detainees, even knowing what year it feels like can become confusing. Because life is not marked by events. It is marked by procedures. The cost of keeping the fortress alive. By 2026, one of the biggest controversies around Guantánamo is not just moral. It is financial. Even with a small detainee population, the facility remains extremely expensive to operate. The U.S. must maintain military staffing, high-level security infrastructure, medical care, transportation, legal systems, court facilities, intelligence operations, all for a prison holding a relatively small number of detainees. For critics, this becomes proof that Guantánamo is inefficient and outdated. For supporters, it remains a necessary cost for national security. But no matter what side someone takes, one fact remains. Guantánamo is not cheap. And it was never meant to be permanent. The quiet reality, a prison that outlived its moment. By 2026, Guantánamo is no longer the center of global fear like it was after September 11th. But it still exists. And that creates a strange contradiction. The prison was created during an emergency. But emergencies are temporary. Guantánamo is not. And the longer it stays open, the more it becomes a symbol, not just of terrorism policy but of what happens when a country builds a system it cannot easily undo. The turning point. And here is where the story takes a darker turn, not in violence but in meaning. Because in 2026, Guantánamo is no longer defined by how many detainees are inside. It is defined by what it represents. A place built outside normal systems. A place built to avoid legal uncertainty. A place that ended up becoming the biggest legal and political problem of all. And now, the world is asking a new question. If Guantánamo Bay still exists after decades of criticism, court rulings, and promises to close it, then what is keeping it alive? Because the next chapter is not about detainees. It is about power. About politics. About why the prison remains open even when leaders admit it damages America's image. And what the future of Guantánamo looks like as the world enters a new era of global conflict. Why Guantánamo still exists. By 2026, Guantánamo Bay is no longer defined by urgency. It is defined by inertia. Presidents have changed. Wars have shifted. Public attention has moved on. Yet the prison remains. And the reason is not a single decision, but a web of political, legal, and international pressures that have made Guantánamo extremely difficult to close. Politics over policy. Closing Guantánamo has never been a simple executive choice. Every attempt has run into resistance from multiple directions. Congress has repeatedly placed restrictions on transferring detainees to the United States. Some lawmakers argue it would create security risks. Others fear political backlash. As a result, even when presidents supported closure, their options were limited. Guantánamo became a prison that no one fully wanted to defend publicly, but few were willing to take responsibility for ending. The problem of where detainees go. By 2026, many detainees have been cleared for transfer. But being cleared does not mean being free. Some detainees cannot return to their home countries due to concerns about safety, instability, or human rights abuses. Other countries are often reluctant to accept them, especially after years of detention without conviction. Each transfer requires diplomatic agreements, security assurances, and political cooperation. And those agreements take time, sometimes years. This means Guantánamo does not empty quickly. It empties slowly. The trials that never end. Another major reason Guantánamo remains open is the unresolved legal cases. The military commission trials, especially those connected to the September 11th attacks, have faced constant delays. Legal disputes over evidence, interrogation history, and court procedures have slowed progress. By 2026, some of the most significant cases are still unresolved. As long as those cases continue, the prison remains necessary in the eyes of the government. Closing Guantánamo without resolving them would mean admitting failure in the justice process. And that is a step no administration has been willing to take. International pressure, and its limits. For years, U.S. allies have criticized Guantánamo. Human rights organizations have called it a violation of international standards. Global leaders have urged the United States to close the facility and move on. But international pressure has limits. No foreign government can force the United States to close Guantánamo. And while criticism affects reputation, it has not been enough to overcome domestic political resistance. So Guantánamo continues, not because it is popular but because it is unresolved. A prison that became a symbol. By 2026, Guantánamo Bay holds fewer detainees than ever before. But its symbolic weight has never disappeared. It represents the fear that followed 9/11, the legal uncertainty of modern warfare, the difficulty of balancing security and human rights, the long-term consequences of emergency decisions. Guantánamo is no longer just a prison. It is a reminder that systems built quickly in times of crisis can last far longer than intended, and that undoing them can be harder than building them. What Guantánamo teaches us. Guantánamo Bay was created as a response to fear. It was meant to protect a nation during an extraordinary moment in history. But by 2026, it has become something else. A lesson. A lesson about how democracies struggle when law, security, and politics collide. A lesson about how detention without clear resolution can stretch across generations. And a lesson about how even powerful countries can become trapped by the systems they create. Whether Guantánamo will finally close, or continue into the future, remains uncertain. But its story already carries a clear message. Decisions made in crisis do not disappear when the crisis ends. They stay, and they shape history. If you found this documentary informative, please like the video, subscribe for more factual history and prison documentaries, and share your thoughts respectfully in the comments. Understanding the past is the first step toward deciding what comes next.